Arizonans have amended the state constitution 140 times in our 100-year history. This year, voters could add to that long list because 8 proposed constitutional amendments are on the election ballot. Tonight on Arizona Week, a ballot proposition primer.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Chiha.
The legislature is asking Arizonans to add 7 amendments to the state constitution in this fall's election, and a citizens initiative group wants an 8th. Because they changed the framework for the way government operates, we'll bring some scrutiny to 5 of the proposals on tonight's show. Next week, we'll look at the other 3. We'll begin with Proposition 115, a legislative effort to modify the selection process for judges in Arizona's 3 biggest counties, Maricopa, Pinal, and Pima. Arizona State University law professor Andy Hessick explained the proposition in an interview this week. Professor Hessick, thanks so much for being with me.
Well, thank you for having me.
Please tell us, what is the gist of Proposition 115? What would it change in the current system?
Right. So the proposition changes a number of things with respect to the selection of judges and justices in the state and the term that those judges and justices will serve. So as for the selection process seems to be the part that everyone's talking about. Right now, the judges are picked by through a merit selection process where there's a committee that picks 3 people, forwards them to the governor, and then the governor picks from among those. One change is that the committee will now put forward 8 names instead of 3, or at least 8 names, and it can do more. Another change is in the makeup of the committee. Right now, the committee consists of 10 non-attorneys and 5 attorneys, but the 5 attorneys are largely picked by the state bar. Under the proposition, the change would be that the governor would pick 4 of those 5 attorneys, and the last attorney would be picked by the state bar.
Now, there are those who say that that's introducing politics into the system. Do you see it that way?
Well, I mean, to some degree, sure, because it means that the governor, who is a political actor and belongs to a particular party, will have more control over who's on the committee, and then those committee members are going to pick more judges, presumably, that are, that have views consistent with their views. And I think tied in with that, there's another provision that says that the names that the committee puts forward, the 8 names, there is no limit on how many are of a particular party. Under the current rule right now, there has to be a diversification of party among the finalists.
Now, some have called this a compromise between the legal community and the legislature and the governor. Legal community on one side, legislature and governor on the other. Have you heard that, and what was the compromise here?
So I have heard that. I'm not precisely sure what the compromise was because I'm not sure what the starting positions were. But I will say that the judiciary always raises an important point in that the judiciary needs to be independent to some degree, but at the same time, we don't want the judiciary completely independent because we're a democracy. We like rule by the people. So there's always a bit of tension between how much independence the judges should have and how much political oversight there should be of the judges. So I imagine the compromise is essentially between 2 different groups with 2 different views about how much independence and how much oversight there should be.
Now, there are those who say that Arizona's system is already highly regarded nationally for the way it picks judges. 2 questions about that. First of all, do you agree with that assessment that Arizona's system is a good one?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That's from not only my experience with them and talking with them and seeing the rulings and cases, but also from talking with people across the country about their views of their respective state judiciaries.
And then second, how would Proposition 115 change that? Would there be less regard for it? Would the merit part of it be in threat in any way?
So I think that some people think that's possible because, as you said, there's a chance for more sort of partisan politics to come into it. But I don't think that it's very likely, or at least to the extent that there is an effect, I think it'll be pretty small. The selection process here is still by merit, as opposed to, say, by election. One of the great concerns with the judiciary is that when you have elections, the judges that are picked more in terms of popularity instead of based on their merit, their abilities, their knowledge of the law. Here, yes, we might have more politics introduced into the process, but it's still a merit selection board. And I have to say, Phoenix and Arizona generally, there are a lot of people in it, and there's a pretty sizable legal market. There are a lot of good attorneys who would be good judges and good justices in both parties.
What would you say to the average voter in Arizona about what he or she should be looking for in connection with this, which to the average voter might look like just a squabble among politicians and lawyers? What's at stake for the average voter?
Right. For the average voter, I'm not sure that much is at stake. As I was sort of suggesting in what I was just saying, I don't know that this will affect the quality of the judiciary very much. I still think that we still have a merit selection system. I still think that very good judges and justices will come out of the process. I guess to the average voter, the question is how much sort of control do they want over the judiciary? There's one other provision that we haven't talked about yet, which goes towards the retention votes. Arizona has a system right now where voters vote on we'll just talk about the justices every 6 years. That time is being extended to 8 years under the proposition. But another provision says that the legislature can take testimony on the justices before that vote comes up. Some people say that's an intrusion on independence, and it is to some degree in that there could be hearings on why precisely a justice ruled a particular way. On the other hand, it does result in more information being available to the voters so that they can make more informed decisions on retention.
Professor Andy Hessick, Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, thanks so much for speaking with me today.
Well, thank you.
We'll bring you an in-depth pro and con look at Proposition 115 on next Friday's program. Now we turn to Proposition 114, which would make crime victims immune from liability. Policy analyst E.J. Perkins of the Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State University explained the proposal. Proposition 114, what's it all about?
Well, basically, it will protect a victim of a crime from being sued by an alleged criminal during the commission of a crime. And the crime we're talking about are just felony crimes. And this thing is really just designed to protect the victim from being taken advantage of from an alleged criminal.
And what are the key arguments for that? Because there already are statutes in place in Arizona that would purport to do that. But why is a constitutional amendment needed from the point of view of the proponents?
Well, that's the very point that's being raised. Opponents to the proposition argue that the statutes already on the books are sufficient and do not require a constitutional remedy. However, the people who are behind the proposition believe that crime victims are exposed to frivolous lawsuits or the potential to be exposed to frivolous lawsuits. And that's the central thrust of it. Arizona's Constitution is strongly worded in terms of protecting the right to sue. And the current statutes safeguard victims' rights is too easily overturned, could too easily be overturned in court. And so that worries a lot of the folks that are behind the proposition.
And who is behind it? It obviously came out of the Republican legislature to get onto the ballot. So conservatives?
Principally conservatives. This was passed largely along partisan lines. And it may grow. Some of this comes out of the larger arena in terms of tort reform. Some people see this as an effort to advance that particular agenda that stems from tort reform.
And tort reform being the general movement away from allowing people to sue for just about any reason, making it more difficult to file lawsuits.
Yes.
And who are the opponents to Proposition 114? You said the vote in the legislature split largely along party lines. So is that Democrats and liberals on the other side of it?
One could say it's primarily progressives that are opposed to this, although it's not strictly along party lines. I suspect there are Republicans out there that would be uneasy with this as well. This is another instance where there's concern about we have statutes on the books. They should be adequate for the job, but yet we're adding yet another layer of constitutional restrictions on something that may not be needed.
And then what would the unintended consequences of it be? Did you take a look at that in your analysis?
A bit. One point that came up during my own research was that there's a possibility that this could get out of control. That if should the measure pass in November, you've got something on the books now that's in the Constitution that a good, smart constitutional lawyer could take to court and change crime victim to corporation. And now you've got an entirely different interpretation of what this measure could mean. And the smart lawyer will know how to manipulate that in court. And so that's not to say that they could, but the possibility exists that this could be misconstrued to mean something else and used for other purposes. And therefore, we're potentially getting on a slippery slope to unintended consequences.
So for the voter, it behooves the average person, before making a decision on how to vote on this, to study it carefully and listen to both sides.
I'd look very closely at this as well. The concerns that the advocates raise are legitimate. There is the possibilities that they raise do exist. However, in my own research, I have not found any actual cases of a victim being successfully sued by a criminal. So that's something else to bear in mind.
Next, we go to Proposition 121, which would change Arizona's election system from party primaries to open primaries, and the general election to one in which the top two primary vote-getters would face off, regardless of party. We first aired this segment 4 weeks ago, featuring Morrison Institute Senior Research Fellow David Berman. Tell us what Proposition 121 will do. How will it change the system?
What the top two system wants to do is have one primary, where all the candidates, all the voters participate, regardless of party. It's somewhat comparable to nonpartisan elections that we find on the local level, with the exception of Tucson, where the partisanship is no longer the most salient thing. What the top two tries to do is to impose or bring about a winnowing system where you just eliminate candidates in the primary and wind up with the top two vote getters, regardless of party, who face each other in the general election.
Now, do you think that will make elections more competitive in Arizona?
Well, it'll make the primaries more competitive, certainly. Everybody, all the candidates, rather than people separating out by party, all the candidates will be in one primary, so that you'll have an awful lot of choice, and you'll be in the same. You'll get to vote in that primary, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, and you'll get your choice of all the candidates. So that would be a lot more competitive. Of course, when you get to the general election and you winnow it down to the two people, then there are probably fewer candidates in the general election than you have now. Third parties would probably have a tough time getting through the primary to put their candidates on the ballot to be one of those top two.
Now, the proponents of this measure say that independent voters are currently pretty much left out of the system and that this will help draw them in. Is that true? Do you see that in your analysis?
Well, I think yes. I think you find that they are pretty much left out of the process, and that you probably will encourage their participation, particularly in the primaries. They're left out of the process because I think many of them in Arizona, even though they have an opportunity to vote in the primary of their choice, don't take advantage of that primary or that opportunity. But what they do under the top two system would be voting in a primary that's open to everybody. It wouldn't be somebody else's primary. It would be open to everyone. And I think that would encourage them, and I think there's some evidence to suggest that that would encourage them to get more involved as voters. And they would have more choice, too.
Now, you said evidence that they might get more involved.
Yeah.
And some of the evidence you cite in the analysis you did is from the state of Washington, which has now had this system in place for 2 or 3 election cycles. What did you find there?
Well, it's hard to come up with definite conclusions on that. In some of the elections, the rate of participation did increase. I don't know if, though, by breaking it down, whether I'll find out that it was somebody else besides independents who actually were more involved. And there have been other elections under the top two system in Washington with the primary where participation was actually lower. I think in California, too, the participation was not as high as people expected in the California primary just held under the top two system in June. But there's so many things that can affect turnout other than the top two system. The candidates, the issues, national trends, a lot of things that determine whether people are going to vote or not.
Whether this system goes into place or not, what political realities are there that will remain in our system?
Well, I think some people argue that, and there is some reason to say this, that the whole proposition is sort of anti-political party, and that it will have a depressing effect on political parties. That's the theme. And I think you can say that the parties are not going to be destroyed by the system. They're going to stick around, and to some extent they're going to game the system. They're going to figure out how to work it. But in a way, and the system itself does not totally eliminate partisanship because you have, as a candidate, the ability to identify your party registration on the ticket and on all election material. So people have an idea who's Republican and who's a Democrat. So I don't see the political reality is that the change could be very modest. It might encourage people to vote for the more moderate candidate. In districts where you have 2 candidates from the same party, the chances are you probably will get the most moderate candidate elected because you'll have independents and people from the other party making that choice as well as the regular party members, and they're likely to skew it. You know, if you have a Republican who is more moderate than another Republican, the Democrats are probably going to vote for that moderate Republican, as would the independents. So that would add a sort of a moderating effect.
So is that moderating effect a good thing in a state that has a reputation of being so conservative?
I think conservative liberal, it's really extremist. That the people who are concerned about who are behind the top two ticket, top two idea. The idea is that we just have 2 ideologically extreme people in office, frankly, and that we can get the more moderate candidates by forcing a top two with a top two system, which maybe 10 to 20% of the time will involve giving people a choice between 2 members of the same political party. And when you do that, then chances are, and I think there's some reason to believe that it would have a moderating effect. But that's marginal. I mean, we're talking about 10% of the seats.
2 more propositions to go, and both involve property taxes. The first, Proposition 116, would give businesses a break on personal property taxes. E.J. Perkins of the Morrison Institute provided this briefing. Tell us about 116. What would it do?
This proposition is very straightforward. Essentially, it would give businesses a bigger break on the taxes they pay on acquired property and equipment, anything outside of real estate.
Proponents call it a job creation proposition. Is it that? And is there any estimate of what kind of jobs and how many it would create?
Well, advocates certainly would agree that it would help in the job creation. Anything that hinders, if a business could acquire new equipment without heavy taxation, then they can hire more employees to put together that new equipment, or to use it, or use it to expand their businesses. And so, to that extent, yes, indeed, it is. It could lead to new jobs.
Now, opponents say it could also shift tax burdens to homeowners because that revenue has to come from somewhere to be made up for in what's lost on the business side. Talk about that a little bit.
That's the argument that opponents will make. However, according to the legislative budget analysis, indicates that the actual impact of this thing on homeowners is minimal. They use an example of it would cost the average homeowner no more than $3 a year. And the same applies to the potential impact on local government. There, too, the impact is minimum. And that's from the Joint Legislative Budget Committee findings.
Which does analysis of all kinds of state budgetary and
Indeed.
finance matters from an objective viewpoint.
That's
right?
correct.
There also were worries expressed about the duality of the system, because what the proposition would do is set up a before and after scenario. Taxes would be paid at the old level on equipment already in place before 2013, and at the lower level on equipment that's purchased and installed from 2013 on. And the State Revenue Department says it may not have the capacity to handle double bookkeeping there. Is that correct?
A representative from the Department of Revenue made that case during one of the budget hearing committees earlier in the year. And he said currently they do not have the computer systems, the databases and the software and so forth, to handle both parallel tax systems. And they do not know, and should this thing pass, when or how much it will take to bring that system online.
So there wasn't any solution to that offered when that part of the discussion came up?
Not at that time. Presumably, it's a solvable problem, but it's just something else that's sort of hanging out there, depending on if this passes in November or not.
And then it's worth noting, as you did in the analysis that you wrote for Morrison, that this passed both houses of the legislature unanimously. How unusual is that?
Very unusual, I'm sorry to say. There was virtually no disagreement between Republicans and Democrats on this. There's a general consensus that this is probably good for business. It's a good way to help spur job creation, and who can argue with that?
And finally, Proposition 117, which would put a limit on property tax valuation increases. Again, E.J. Perkins. We're talking about Proposition 117 today, property tax valuation limits. Explain what it would do.
Well, basically what this would do is simplify the property tax system by creating a single valuation that would not increase by more than 5% annually.
Does it do as intended by its proponents? That is, does it simplify Arizona's very complex property tax code?
It seems to. Right now, the state has a very complicated tax system, and it's broken into two components, as a lot of homeowners may know. There's the full cash value, and then there's what's called a limited property value. And taxes are calculated based on that. The full cash value number is something that funds bonds, budget overrides, and things like that. The limited value is calculated by a statutory formula, and that funds things like maintenance, operation of school districts, and items like that. So that did give you a little background on what those two values are are used for.
Opponents say that the problem with this proposition is that it doesn't limit taxes themselves, it only limits the valuation increase, and it still would allow local jurisdictions to set tax rates that would continue to increase taxes without limits. Is that correct?
That's my understanding of how this works.
And opponents also seem to include folks who are on the more conservative side on this, want greater limits on taxes, tax rates, tax valuations. And in fact, there seems to be a bit of a California Proposition 13 style tax increase limit movement behind the opposition. Have you encountered that in your look at this proposition?
Yes, it seems to be moving in that direction, or at least that's the hope that advocates hope it will eventually evolve into. Now, whether that actually happens or not is another matter. Advocates say that the property tax system will stabilize the system and insulate the taxpayers from higher taxes, or rather dramatic increases or surges in their tax bills. And so that's their principal argument. You saw that during the downturn, 2006 to 2008, when valuations skyrocketed and tax bills sort of went along with that. And so it is hoped that this would help temper those kinds of fluctuations.
Do you see any sign in this that it may be a stepping stone toward a Proposition 13 style amendment down the road at all?
There's a possibility of that happening, depending on how this fares in the November elections.
Proposition 13, of course, was the California amendment from 2 or 3 decades ago that put very strict limits on how much property taxes could increase as long as the same person owned the home from year to year, right?
That's correct, yes.
The interviews you saw tonight and more information on all the propositions are on the Your Vote 2012 section of our website, azpm.org, along with campaign news, candidate profiles, and more. That's our program for Friday, October 19th, 2012. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Chihak.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.